Potato, Solanum tuberosum, the cultivated potato, unlike the other crops that are been described so far in this webinar series, is an autotetraploid. The base number of chromosomes in potato is 12, so cultivated potato has 48 chromosomes. There are also cultivated diploid potatoes, which are not very widely grown, only exist pretty much in a few places in South America. But there are lots of diploid wild potato species. An interesting difference between diploid potatoes and cultivated potatoes is that diploid potatoes are almost invariably self-incompatible, but that self-incompatibility, the gametophytic self-incompatibility, breaks down when you double the chromosome number. So it's possible to cultivated potatoes, but we typically don't do that in a breeding program because potato suffers from pretty serious inbreeding depression. Potatoes are, I think as everybody knows, vegetatively propagated, so a potato variety is actually a clone. All the plants are in a variety are genetically identical. The clonal propagation, the autotetraploidy, and the high level of heterozygosity that characterize potato have some pretty significant impacts on how new potato varieties are developed, which we'll eventually get to. In the picture here, you can see some potato flowers. Making crosses in potato is quite easy. The flowers are complete. If you'd like to get pollen, you can put a small tube, like an Eppendorf tube, over the anther cone and vibrate the back with an electric toothbrush. And you'll get lots of pollen, and transferring it to the exposed stigma at the center of the flowers on the female plant is pretty straightforward too. Potatoes were domesticated 7 to 10,000 years ago in the Andes, in the area around Lake Titicaca, which is situated at the border of modern-day Bolivia and Peru. The elevation of Lake Titicaca is quite high. It's about 3,800 meters above sea level, so this is obviously a rather cool environment, and thus potatoes originated as a cool weather crop. In most of the world, potatoes are grown in rather cool locations, closer to the poles than to the equator, but are also grown in the highlands. And because there's so much genetic variation in potato has also been bred to tolerate higher heat than where it was originally domesticated. Since domestication, there have been two key developments that have changed domesticated potatoes compared to wild potatoes. The first was that over time, early domesticators selected for potatoes that had reduced glycoalkaloid content. Glycoalkaloids are toxic and bitter compounds that you've probably all tasted if you've ever bitten into a chunk of potato that had some green tissue in it. When you expose potatoes to light, it induces chlorophyll to form. That's not a problem, but also induces glycoalkaloids to form, and that's what imparts the bitter flavor. Wild potatoes invariably have high levels of glycoalkaloids, but cultivated potatoes have very low levels. And a second important change that happened to potatoes during domestication, at least in the past 400 years since potatoes left the Andes and have moved around the rest of the world, is that they have been selected for the ability to tuberize under long days. In the United States, potato production is pretty widely distributed. I guess that every single state produces at least some potatoes, but the heaviest concentration of potato production is in the Pacific Northwest, where Idaho, Washington, and Oregon produce the bulk of the nation's potatoes. There were about 1.1 million acres of potatoes planted in 2012 with an average yield of about 40,000 pounds per acre. So potato is quite a high-yielding crop. As someone who's located in New York State, I can't help but point out that 100 years ago, New York actually grew more potatoes than Idaho does today. But potato production has moved over the past century to the West Coast because the growing seasons are longer. And the availability of water and large tracts of land have facilitated potato production. It made it easier in the Northwest than it is in the Northeast. On a global basis, this map shows where potatoes are are grown to any meaningful scale. And you can see, in addition to North America, there's high concentrations, uh, high, high amounts of potatoes produced in Europe, India, and China. India and China are relatively recent additions to potato production, and they're now the number two and number one nations in producing potatoes, respectively. It's quite a remarkable change. It's happened just over the past few decades. And it's also remarkable to see how widely potatoes are grown on the planet today, given that 400 years ago you could only find them in South America. They've spread very quickly and very widely in a short period of time. In terms of market classes, there are basically three classes of potatoes. Potatoes in the top right-hand corner here that are intended for making French fries. This is a photograph of Russet Burbank, probably the most famous potato variety in the world. The bottom left are some potatoes that are intended for making potato chips, and the bottom right happen to be some fresh market potatoes. Key difference between French fry and chip potatoes is shape. French fry potatoes need to be long to make long French fries. Chip potatoes are generally round. Fresh market potatoes can come in just about any shape or color that you can imagine. As long as they're pretty and taste good, it's okay. So now we'll shift gears and talk about what kind of traits